Dinner was served, but the chef never tasted it. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing this community grow. Hearing from you all makes every mystery feel alive. Let's begin. If I'd known that a knock on the brownstone door would end with Wolfe breaking his personal commandment about clients and cuisine, I might have let it go unanswered. But I've got a reputation to maintain, and it doesn't include hiding behind the hat rack while a potential client steams on the stoop. It was a damp Thursday afternoon, one of those New York days that smells like boiled wool and exhaust. Fritz was in the kitchen making his weekly truce with the truffles. Wolfe was in the plant rooms talking to his orchids, in a tone more affectionate than he ever used on people. And I was in the office working on my crossword, which is to say not working. That's when the bell rang twice briskly, not the hesitant ding of a lost tourist, nor the long desperate push of a process server. This was confidence wrapped in impatience. I went to the door. The man standing there was tall, dressed in white, and carried himself like he'd been knighted with a carving knife. His chef's coat was spotless, his expression less so. "Archie Goodwin?" he asked. His voice had the trained projection of someone used to shouting over a kitchen brigade. "On my better days," I said. "And you are?" "Lucien Duret, executive chef at Le Palais Vert." That got my attention. Wolfe didn't dine out, but he kept a file, mental and written, on every restaurant in Manhattan worth chewing in. Le Palais Vert had recently earned its third Michelin star, which in the gastronomic religion Wolfe practiced was equivalent to canonization. "Come in, Mr. Duret," I said, stepping aside. "You've come to the right place, though I can't promise you a table." He didn't smile. He walked into the office, paused as his eyes adjusted to the brownstone's calm dimness, and gave a look that took in Wolfe's empty chair, the desk, the globe, the rows of books, and me again. "Is he in?" "Not yet. He communes with orchids from 9 to 11 and 4 to 6. It's his idea of meditation. If your problem can wait till the next resurrection, he'll see you at 6 sharp." "It can't wait," Duret said. "A matter of, well, let's call it professional sabotage." That's when the door to the hall opened and Wolfe appeared, gliding in with the majesty of a battleship under full dignity. He was wearing his yellow silk dressing gown, and the expression he reserves for intrusions that don't come with caviar. "You are Mr. Lucien Duret?" Wolfe said without inflection. Duret nodded. "I am Mr. Wolfe. Wolfe raised a hand like a magistrate calling a witness to silence. "You have brought a problem into my house. You will first sit." Archie, beer, that was the opening ceremony. When Wolfe offers beer before introductions, it's not hospitality, it's reconnaissance. Fritz brought the bottle and glass. Wolfe poured it himself, which told me he was already interested. He took one sip, regarded Duret with lidded eyes, and said, "Proceed." Duret exhaled. "Someone is trying to destroy me. Or at least my reputation. Last night, a critic from the New York Chronicle collapsed after dinner at my restaurant. Food poisoning. Mild, but enough to send him to the hospital and send every gossip column in town into hysterics. They're saying it was deliberate. And was it?" Wolfe asked, calm as custard. "No." Duret snapped. "My kitchen is impeccable, but someone switched ingredients. A truffle puree was replaced, tampered with. I don't know how." Wolfe's eyes flicked once toward me. "Sabotage, then." "You have suspects?" Duret hesitated. "Several. A rival sous chef, who was recently dismissed. A supplier with a grudge. Possibly my partner in the restaurant, René Valmont. He and I disagree on management." Wolfe grunted. "Who came to me because the police would laugh at culinary conspiracies?" "Yes," Duret said, leaning forward. "And because your reputation, Mr. Wolfe, extends even to Paris. They say you understand appetite, and its crimes." Wolfe's lips twitched. "It might have been pride." "You flatter efficiently." He looked at me. "Archie, note that I have not accepted this case." "Noted," I said. Duret stood tense. "Then don't, but at least taste this." He reached into his briefcase and placed a small sealed jar on Wolfe's desk. This is what was served to the critic. The so-called truffle puree. I brought it myself. You'll see. It was tampered with. Wolfe's expression went through 3 distinct shades of irritation before settling on reluctant curiosity. He stared at the jar as if it were a suspect in handcuffs. Fritz will analyze it, he said finally. Leave your address. Archie will visit your establishment tomorrow morning. I will consider. Duret inclined his head. Thank you. That's all I ask. He turned and left as quickly as he'd arrived, leaving behind the faintest trace of saffron and anxiety. Wolfe stared at the jar for a long moment, then said, Archie. Yeah? I despise being manipulated. Then it's your lucky day, I said. He didn't even get the chance. Wolfe's eyes flicked toward the kitchen. Fritz must not be disturbed until I instruct him. This matter, though culinary in nature, may prove indigestible, I grinned. Meaning we're taking the case? He sighed. Meaning, he said, that curiosity like hunger can be a tyrant. Bring me the jar. Wolfe didn't touch the jar again that night. He had Fritz place it in the refrigerator, sealed inside a glass box as though it might leap out and confess. When Fritz asked what it contained, Wolfe merely said a provocation, that was all. For the rest of the evening, he retreated to the plant rooms where I could hear him muttering to the orchids in tones of reluctant fascination. If the man ever ran out of mysteries, he'd invent them out of boredom, and this jar was the latest specimen. The next morning broke grey and sticky, the kind of day that makes you think twice about leaving the brownstone. Wolfe didn't think twice because he wasn't leaving at all. He was at his desk by 9, ensconced behind the Times and a breakfast of shirred eggs with more butter than sense. I brought him his second coffee and the morning's gossip column, which led with the headline, Critic collapses at Le Palais Vert, sabotage or slip-up. Wolfe's eyes moved down the page slowly, the way a boa constrictor studies a rabbit before deciding if it's worth the trouble. Archie, he said without looking up, Mr. Duret is being pilloried. Yeah, I said. And his partner's getting the sympathy quotes. Valmont says the restaurant's reputation will survive, provided Chef Duret takes responsibility, which is French for I'm innocent. Please ruin him instead. Indeed. Wolfe folded the paper and laid it beside the plate. You will go to Le Palais Vert this morning. Speak with Duret, observe his kitchen, and learn what you can of Mr. Valmont. You will also determine whether this alleged sabotage could have been effected without Duret's knowledge. In other words, sniff around without ordering lunch. Do not jest, he said sharply. You are entering a sanctum of gustatory vanity. Restrain your tongue. Always a challenge, I said, reaching for my hat. You want Saul on this? Not yet, Wolfe murmured. We are still in the stage of conjecture. Bring me facts, clean, precise, and digestible. Le Palais Vert occupied the ground floor of a pre-war building on East 62nd, all brushed brass and glass panels so spotless they reflected your sins back at you. The maitre d' gave me a look that measured my suit against his standards and came up short, but when I mentioned Duret's name, his eyebrows performed a full pirouette and he led me down a corridor toward the kitchen. If you've never been in a 3-star kitchen during prep hours, imagine a cathedral built by nervous geniuses, polished steel instead of marble, knives instead of candles, and a quiet that hums with concentration. Duret stood in the middle, issuing orders in a low musical tone that made even the commis move as if conducting a symphony. When he saw me, his face softened, though not by much. Mr. Goodwin, I'm grateful you came. I wasn't sure, Mr. Wolfe. Never be sure about Mr. Wolfe, I said. He's allergic to predictability. Mind if I take a look around? He nodded, motioning for a sous chef to clear a path. Everything is as it was last night, except for the truffle puree. That batch was destroyed, of course. I walked the line, fish station, meat, pastry, watching hands, eyes, and small rituals. Kitchens are built on discipline, but this one carried a pulse of unease. Every movement was a shade too careful. Guilt or fear of being accused. Who had access to the truffle jar? I asked. 3 people, Duret said. My sous chef Claire Renard, my supplier, an Italian named Tonio Bellini, and myself. The jar was opened only during prep. The puree is made from white truffles, extremely delicate. Anybody else handle it? Only Valmont, he admitted reluctantly. He insists on approving ingredients. It's his way of reminding me who owns the majority stake. That put Valmont squarely on my list, along with anyone who liked the idea of seeing Duret knocked off his pedestal. I asked to see Claire Renard, who turned out to be a small, efficient woman with eyes like sharpened slate. When I mentioned sabotage, she stiffened. I would never risk this kitchen, she said. Chef Duret trained me. He is, she paused, searching for the word, but precise, but he makes enemies easily. He demands too much. Such as? Perfection, she said simply, and went back to dicing chives with surgical detachment. That afternoon I paid a courtesy call on Valmont. His office was upstairs, panelled in walnut and smugness. He was the sort of man who wore perfume like a weapon. He greeted me with a handshake as soft as a confession. "Ah, you're with Mr. Wolfe, extraordinary man, they say." Though I confess I didn't expect his interest in restaurant gossip. "It's not gossip when it sends someone to the hospital," I said. "You believe Duret's innocent?" Valmont spread his hands. "Innocent? That depends. Genius often comes with unpredictability. Lucien is brilliant but volatile. If he erred, it was out of arrogance, not malice. And if he didn't err—" He smiled faintly. Then perhaps someone decided the time had come for a change of leadership. That line stuck with me all the way back to West 35th Street. Wolfe was waiting, eyes closed, hands tented like a bishop. When I finished my report, he nodded once. "So Valmont implies revolt," he murmured. "Miss Renard implies devotion. And Mr. Bellini? He's next on my list." I called. "He's in Queens. Small supplier, family business. Go tomorrow," Wolfe said. "This evening Fritz will examine the puree." That night the kitchen lights burned late. Fritz set up his impromptu laboratory. Microscope, scales, a box of chemical reagents Wolfe had imported from Switzerland for culinary emergencies. I watched from the doorway as he scraped a sample from the jar. The scent of truffle filled the room, earthy, rich, then oddly bitter. At 10:30, Wolfe summoned me to the office. Fritz stood nearby, pale and stiff. On Wolfe's desk sat the open jar, its contents glistening under the lamp like damp velvet. There was tampering, Wolfe said quietly. Fritz detected a trace of amanitin, the toxin found in death-cap mushrooms. Lethal though the dose here was diluted. Then someone tried to kill the critic. Not kill, Wolfe corrected, but wound reputations. A fatality would have provoked an autopsy and police scrutiny. A fainting spell merely stirs scandal. He leaned back, eyes half-lidded. This was done by a mind that understands consequence. Valmont? Possibly. But note the subtlety. The toxin was blended into the puree without altering its aroma. That requires intimate knowledge of truffle chemistry. Few possess it. He turned to Fritz. "You will not discuss this, not even with your suppliers." "Of course, sir," Fritz said. Wolfe looked at me. "Tomorrow you will see Mr. Bellini. I want to know who delivered the truffles and when." And Archie exercised discretion. "Whoever arranged this prefers shadows." I gave him a nod and reached for my coat. "You really think this is just about reputation?" He stared into the distance. "No, appetite is never so simple. This is envy disguised as artistry. Someone seeks not merely to ruin a chef, but to corrupt his craft." And with that he turned to his beer, signaling the end of conversation. Fritz cleared the jar away like it was evidence of original sin, and the brownstone fell back into its habitual silence. Only later, as I turned off the lights, did I catch Wolfe's reflection in the glass, still immense, thoughtful, and knew that whatever he'd swallowed of the case, it had already begun to digest him. The next morning began with the city still half asleep, and me wishing I'd followed its example. The trip to Queens was scheduled for 9, which meant crossing the river through commuter traffic that could drive a priest to profanity. Wolfe had instructed me to be civil but skeptical, which for me meant smiling, while taking notes I'd later translate into English. Tonio. Pellini's establishment was a narrow warehouse tucked behind a row of fish markets, its sign half faded from the years of steam and sea air. Inside, the scent of earth, mushrooms, and faint mildew wrapped around me like an overfamiliar coat. Bellini himself emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a towel, his eyes bright and wary. He had the kind of face you'd expect to see smiling behind a deli counter, honest, tired, but not stupid. "Ah, Signor Goodwin," he said with a warm accent that almost disarmed me. "Mr. Durette called me last night, said you come. He says there was poison in my truffles." "Not poison," I said. "Just a misunderstanding that nearly ruined a man's career. You mind walking me through your deliveries?" He led me to a ledger, its pages full of looping Italian script. "I delivered 2 kilos white truffle to Le Palais Vert 3 days ago. Always the same routine, straight from my importer in Alba. No substitution." He thumped the ledger. "If someone play games, it is not me. Who handled the shipment once it left you?" "Only my driver Pietro, good boy. Never late, never steal. But the kitchen, so many hands there. The sous chefs, the suppliers, one mistake and they blame the truffles. Mind if I talk to Pietro?" Bellini called him out. Pietro was 20, nervous and built like a string bean. He swore up and down that the box never left his sight from truck to kitchen door. I pressed for details, who received it, what time, but his answers were simple and consistent. 11:15 a.m. Directly to Claire Renard, the sous chef. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened without comment while I relayed it all. He was in his chair, the afternoon sunlight slicing through the blinds across his bulk like a tiger's stripes. When I finished, he closed his eyes, steepling his fingers. "Miss Renard again," he said. "Twice now her name emerges at crucial intersections. She's devoted," I reminded him. "Or so she says." "Devotion," Wolfe murmured, "is often the most reliable disguise for betrayal. It allows intimacy and access." He rang for Fritz. "The remaining truffles in the jar, dispose of them carefully. Then call Saul Panzer. Archie, we will require observation at Le Palais Vert tonight." "Observation? You expect the saboteur to strike again?" "I expect human nature to remain consistent. Whoever engineered this will seek to ensure its success, or to bury its traces. Either impulse is useful to us." By 6 o'clock, I was in a borrowed tuxedo at the bar of Le Palais Vert, trying to look like a man interested in fine dining instead of fine evidence. Saul sat 2 tables over, pretending to nurse a martini. Durrit was back in the kitchen, and the evening service hummed with restrained tension. The critic who'd been poisoned was still in recovery. But that didn't stop half the city's elite from reserving tables just to see what scandal tasted like. At 8, I slipped to the hallway leading to the back pantry. Saul had eyes on the dining room. My job was to catch any stray hands near the ingredients. For 45 minutes nothing happened except a dishwasher, humming Puccini. Then Claire appeared, moving fast. She carried a small paper parcel and looked around before slipping it into a lower cabinet. I waited until she left, then opened it. Ordinary salt. But inside the paper was a second, smaller pouch wrapped in waxed linen, containing fine white powder that didn't belong in any recipe I knew. I pocketed the pouch and returned to the bar. 10 minutes later, Valmont walked in. He hadn't been expected that evening, judging from Duret's expression when he saw him. They exchanged a few heated words near the kitchen entrance before Valmont turned away with a satisfied smirk. When I got back to the brownstone after midnight, Wolfe was waiting, robe replaced by his favorite yellow dressing gown, beer at his elbow. I laid the pouch on his desk. He examined it without touching, nostrils flaring slightly. "Bitter almond," he said after a pause. "Cyanogenic compound. This is not culinary mischief. It is premeditated. That means someone planned to finish what the poison started." He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Miss Renard placed it?" "Slipped it into a cabinet like she was hiding a love letter. I didn't see her use it. Then she is either accomplice or dupe. In either case, She holds the thread. Tomorrow she must be brought here. Think she'll come? She will, Wolfe said, because I shall invite her under the authority of curiosity, which she will mistake for sympathy. He leaned back, eyes gleaming like amber under the lamplight. Mr. Duray is not our only client now, Archie. The true patron is the crime itself, and it is beginning to show its shape. I didn't argue. When Wolfe started talking like that, the game was already moving 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I just noted that his beer was untouched, always a sign his mind was chewing on something bigger than the case. Before I turned in, I glanced back into the office. He sat there motionless, staring at the tiny pouch as though it were a riddle whispered by Mephistopheles himself. The brownstone was quiet, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of home. It was the kind that waits listening, just before the storm finds its target. Claire Renard arrived the next morning precisely at 10, which told me she was punctual, nervous, or both. Wolfe had instructed me to bring her directly to the office, which I did, after offering her coffee that she refused with the polite stiffness of a woman trying to stay in control of a situation already lost. She wore a dark grey suit, no makeup, hair tied back as though any softness might be mistaken for guilt. When Wolfe greeted her, he didn't rise, he never does, but his tone had that peculiar warmth he reserves for people whose minds he's about to dissect. "Miss Renard," he said, "thank you for coming. Sit, please. Mr. Goodwin has told me you are the linchpin of Mr. Duray's kitchen. Efficient, loyal, precise. Admirable qualities. Thank you," she said, her French accent faint but precise. "Though I suppose that depends on why you asked me here." "Ah, candor," Wolfe murmured. "Excellent. I dislike preambles. You were seen concealing a packet in a kitchen cabinet last night." Her face drained of color. "What? No!" She looked at me, as though I might retract the statement for her. I didn't. "It was salt." "I had simply—" "The salt was innocent," Wolfe interrupted. "The packet within was not. It contained cyanogenic powder, an agent that would have rendered the next truffle dish lethal." For a full 5 seconds she sat frozen, eyes wide, breathing shallow. Then she leaned forward. "I didn't know. I swear on my life I didn't know what was inside. Chef Duray told me to hide it. He said it was a rare spice, his secret touch. That landed like a cracked plate between us." Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits, but his tone didn't rise. "You accuse Mr. Duray of asking you to conceal a substance you never questioned." Her voice trembled. "I trusted him. He taught me everything. He said it was not for anyone else to see, that it would change the flavor, make the dish unforgettable." Wolfe nodded once, heavily. "And it would have, Miss Renard. Fatally so." He turned slightly toward me. "Archie, have Saul verify her movements from the previous evening. If she speaks truth, she left the restaurant at 10:15 and went straight home." She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again, as if realizing resistance would only tighten the noose. Wolfe gestured to the door. "You may wait in the front room. Do not leave." When she was gone, I looked at Wolfe. "So Duray's our chef and our poisoner. That was fast." "Too fast," Wolfe said. "Miss Renard's accusation is convenient, and convenience is a poor substitute for truth. Mr. Duray's temperament is volatile, yes, but self-destructive? Unlikely. The man lives for acclaim. A scandal would ruin him, unless he thought he could frame Valmont and come out looking like the victim." "Possible," Wolfe admitted, "but Valmont's ambitions extend to reputation, not cuisine. He would hardly know how to lace a puree without killing his own staff. So what's the next step?" Wolfe reached for the phone and dialed with deliberate precision. "The next step, Archie, is confrontation." He called Le Palais Vert and asked for Duray, his tone mild, almost apologetic. I could hear Duret's outrage through the receiver, even from across the room. Wolfe endured it as one endures a summer storm, then said simply, "Come at noon. If you decline, I will have no choice but to send the evidence to the police." When he hung up, his mouth twitched in what passed for satisfaction. "He will come." At 12 sharp, Lucien Duray arrived, every inch the wounded artist. His face was drawn, his collar open, and his voice shook with righteous fury. "You drag me into your house to accuse me? After I trusted you?" "You flatter yourself," Wolfe said mildly. "I accuse no one." "I inquire." "Miss Renard asserts that you instructed her to conceal a packet, one containing a deadly compound." Duret froze, then barked a short, incredulous laugh. "She said that absurd. The girl must be hysterical. I told her to protect a rare spice from theft, yes, but poison? Never." "And yet," Wolfe said, "the powder was found precisely where she placed it. Then she planted it." Duret shouted. "Or Valmont used her. He hates me, Wolfe. He envies my talent. He'd do anything to—" "Mr. Duret." Wolfe's voice cut through like a cleaver through cream. "Enough, sit." For a moment it looked like Duret might refuse. Then he sat, breathing hard. Wolfe regarded him with the patience of a man waiting for the fire to burn itself out. "You both deny ownership of the powder. That presents us with three possibilities. Miss Renard lies, you lie, or both of you are being used by a third party. The last is most probable, given the sophistication of the sabotage." Duret blinked, thrown off balance. "Third party? Who?" "Someone with access," Wolfe said. "Knowledge of your ingredients, your routines, and your temperaments. Someone who could anticipate your reactions and orchestrate discord." "Valmont," Duret whispered. "It must be him." "Perhaps," Wolfe murmured. "But Mr. Valmont's motives are transparent. The more interesting question is how he could manipulate your kitchen without stepping foot in it." I caught on first. "A supplier," I said. "Bellini." Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Bellini or someone in his circle. The driver, Pietro, was the last to touch the truffles before they entered the kitchen. He delivered them to Miss Renard, who trusts both him and you implicitly. A perfect channel for mischief." Duret frowned. "But why?" "He profits from my success. He'd be mad to risk it." "Madness," Wolfe said dryly, "is often a byproduct of desperation. Or debt." He looked at me. "Archie, visit Mr. Bellini again. But this time do not ask about truffles. Ask about loans, collectors, and creditors. If he resists, observe his reaction. We may find that the roots of this poison are financial, not culinary." I headed out immediately. The day had turned warm and heavy, the kind of weather that makes New Yorkers short-tempered and suspicious. When I reached Bellini's warehouse, Pietro was outside smoking, and the moment he saw me, his expression flickered, fear quick and sharp. Before he masked it, "Mr. Bellini's not here," he said too quickly. "I didn't ask yet," I told him. "Where is he?" "Deliveries," he said, looking away. "Maybe back in an hour. Mind if I wait inside?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Suit yourself." The office smelled of damp paper and oil. I glanced through the ledger again, this time paying attention to side notes, tiny initials, notations of payments. Several were marked RV. When Bellini returned, he looked exhausted. I held up the ledger. "You've got Valmont on here." He froze. "Sometimes he pays for shipments," he said. "Nothing wrong with that, except he's a part owner of the restaurant you supply. That's conflict of interest, Bellini. And if one of those shipments went bad, who'd get the blame? Not Valmont." He swallowed hard and sweat broke across his forehead. "Please," he said softly. "I didn't mean harm. Valmont told me to replace one jar, just one, with a sample he provided. He said it was truffle essence, an experiment. I swear I didn't know it was poison. I let him stew in his panic a moment longer, before calling Wolfe from the payphone. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was waiting, of course. I gave him the story, every detail." He nodded once. "As expected," he said. "Valmont orchestrated the substitution. Bellini executed it. Miss Renard and Duret served as his unknowing instruments. Elegant, efficient, and until now undetected." He leaned back, eyes half closed. "But he has made one fatal error. He believed no one could connect him to the alteration. Tomorrow evening we will invite them all here. Duret, Valmont, Bellini, and Miss Renard. Then, Mr. Goodwin, we shall dine on justice." I grinned. "And what's on the menu?" Wolfe's mouth curved faintly. The truth, Archie. Properly seasoned. That night the house was quieter than usual. Fritz cooked, Wolfe read, and I sat by the window watching the rain begin to fall, soft and steady. It wasn't just weather. It was the world washing itself clean before the storm we'd set for tomorrow. Wolfe, as always, said nothing more. He didn't need to. The pieces were on the board, and his mind was already playing the final moves. Morning came with the kind of quiet that precedes orchestration. Wolfe's brownstone was unnaturally still, as though the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. He was at his desk when I came down, already dressed in his brown suit, a splash of yellow handkerchief tucked neatly in his pocket. When Wolfe dressed early, it meant one of two things: he expected company or war. In this case, they were the same. "Good morning, sir," I said, pouring myself coffee. "I assume we're still hosting that little dinner theatre tonight." He gave me a look that suggested I was fortunate to still possess vocal cords. "Mr. Goodwin, this is not theatre. It is inquiry under controlled conditions. Each guest will reveal himself, as surely as a soufflé reveals the hand that whipped it. Meaning you're planning to serve accusation for the main course?" "I plan to serve comprehension," he said. "But yes, if it proves palatable, accusation may accompany it." The invitations had gone out the previous evening. Formal summonses, typed and delivered by hand, asking Duret, Valmont, Claire Renard, and Bellini to attend a culinary consultation at Wolfe's residence at 8 p.m. sharp. Wolfe liked to use understatement as bait. He said that those who thought themselves innocent would come out of curiosity, and those who knew they weren't would come out of fear. He was rarely wrong on either count. The day passed in deliberate calm. Fritz, after being briefed, prepared the dining room as if expecting royalty, muttering under his breath about poison in good truffles being a sin worse than heresy. Wolfe remained in the office most of the day, dictating notes to me, occasionally pausing to stare at the telephone as though it were a co-conspirator. I knew better than to ask what he was waiting for. When Wolfe withheld information, it wasn't stinginess, it was strategy. Around 5, Saul Panzer dropped by for a report. He'd spent the day tailing Valmont, confirming that the man had met with no one unusual and had made no preparations to flee. Wolfe nodded when Saul finished and dismissed him with quiet satisfaction. "Our quarry is confident," he said once Saul left. "Confidence is the most obliging trait of the guilty." At 7:30 the first knock came. Fritz opened the door to reveal Claire Renard, looking more composed than yesterday, but not by much. She clutched her purse as though it contained her future. Wolfe greeted her politely and motioned her to the red chair near the window. Duret arrived next, wearing his chef's whites under a trench coat, a uniform even in battle. He glanced at Claire but didn't speak. Bellini followed, sweating and subdued, eyes darting like a man who'd learned that truth is just another kind of trap. Valmont was the last, perfectly punctual, in a charcoal suit and an expression of measured arrogance. Wolfe waited until they were seated, then closed his eyes briefly, as if savoring the scent of their collective unease. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and almost lazy. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for indulging me. You are here because a culinary masterpiece was corrupted. A dish meant to delight was turned into a weapon. I have before me every element necessary to identify the hand that wielded it." Valmont smiled faintly. "Mr. Wolfe, this sounds very dramatic. Surely this is unnecessary." "The police would be ill-equipped," Wolfe interrupted, "to understand crimes committed through subtleties of taste and trust. I, however, am not." He gestured toward the small table beside his desk, where the infamous jar of truffle puree now sat, cleaned and labeled. "Here lies the centerpiece of your misfortune." It contained amanitin, a toxin derived from mushrooms, not enough to kill, but sufficient to collapse a critic and destroy reputations. Mr. Duret's first instinct was self-preservation, Miss Renard's obedience, Mr. Bellini's denial. "And yours, Mr. Valmont, self-congratulation?" Valmont's smile thinned. "You accuse me, then?" I do not accuse, Wolfe said softly. I deduce. He turned slightly to me. Archie, kindly read from your notes of yesterday's conversation with Mr. Bellini. I opened my notebook and read aloud the relevant portion. Bellini's confession that Valmont had requested he substitute one jar as an experiment, assuring him it contained truffle essence. Bellini's admission that he accepted payment without question. When I finished, Wolfe looked at Valmont. Would you care to refute this? Valmont's face didn't change, but a flicker passed behind his eyes. Preposterous. The man lies to save himself. I've never handled such materials in my life, Wolfe nodded slowly. Indeed. And yet the ledger from your supplier's office lists payments marked with your initials, corresponding precisely to shipments delivered to Le Palais Vert. Curious coincidence, no? Duret leaned forward, fists clenched. You paid Bellini behind my back. Why, Valmont turned on him sharply. Because you were bleeding the restaurant dry with your arrogance. Critics feared to cross you. Investors despised you. I built that empire while you played the genius. Wolfe raised a hand. The room fell silent. There it is, he said. The confession veiled but sufficient. You sought to destroy Duret's reputation while maintaining plausible innocence. A sick critic, a whisper of scandal, a chef's fall from grace, all would leave you free to assume control, absolved by public sympathy. Valmont's face darkened. You can prove none of this. On the contrary, Wolfe said, I can prove intent, opportunity, and method. The powder found last night in the cabinet contained trace residue of bitter almond, a compound not derived from the truffle supply but from synthetic extracts, imported by a fragrance company in which you hold shares. The invoice arrived this morning. For a moment the air thickened. Duret stared. Claire gasped softly. Bellini buried his face in his hands. Valmont's composure fractured just enough to show the tremor beneath. This is absurd, he said finally, voice shaking. So you fabricated Archie, Wolfe said quietly. I reached into my pocket and produced a small glass vial, Saul's latest contribution. This came from Valmont's office trash, I said. Label reads truffle essence for testing only. Same chemical composition as the powder. That was the final note. Valmont slumped back, lips pressed tight. Wolfe watched him a moment, then spoke with measured gravity. You will, of course, be arrested. Mr. Duret will inform the authorities. But before you depart, let us speak plainly. You attempted to ruin a man through poison because you lacked the courage to surpass him through craft. That, Mr. Valmont, is the most contemptible form of envy, one that corrupts the art it pretends to serve. No one moved. The only sound was the faint tick of the clock and the rain against the window. Duret's breathing was ragged. Claire sat rigid, eyes wide. Bellini looked like he might faint. Finally, Wolfe rang for Fritz. Fritz, he said, see that Mr. Valmont has water. He looks unwell. Then call Inspector Kramer. When the door closed behind them, Wolfe exhaled deeply as though dismissing the last fumes of poison from his sanctum. Archie, he said, you will note that the sanctity of this household has once again been disturbed by the follies of ambition. But at least for once we are spared the inconvenience of a corpse. I grinned. You sure? You just murdered a man's ego. Wolfe's lips twitched, almost a smile. Egos, Mr. Goodwin, are renewable resources. Decency, less so. When they were gone and the house fell back into its natural rhythm, Wolfe settled into his chair with his beer. The orchids upstairs waited. Dinner was nearly ready, and the storm outside had begun to fade. The case was closed, and once again the brownstone was whole. As I turned off the office light, Wolfe's voice floated through the dimness, calm and final. Archie, he said, remind me never to dine anywhere ambition outweighs appetite. I said, oh, yes, sir, and shut the door. The next morning, the air in the brownstone carried that rare stillness that comes only after a storm of intellect. The night before had left a residue, something heavier than victory but lighter than guilt. Wolfe had restored order to the world, or at least his small corner of it. Yet the balance between satisfaction and weariness hung in the air like the last note of a symphony waiting to fade. Fritz moved quietly in the kitchen, the comforting clatter of breakfast echoing like punctuation to a sleepless night. I came down late, because I'd stayed up thinking about Valmont's face when the truth landed. Some men get angry, some crumble. Valmont had done neither. He'd just sagged, like a marionette whose strings had been cut, the kind of fall that leaves no sound, but leaves a mark on everyone in the room. Wolfe was already in his chair, robe folded just so, a half-empty bottle of beer sweating on the coaster beside him. He had the Times open but wasn't reading it. His eyes were distant, fixed somewhere above the orchids in the corner. It was one of those mornings where he looked less like a man and more like a monument to silence. "Good morning, boss," I said, testing the air. "You look contemplative. That means either you're reconsidering the moral implications of justice or you're wondering what Fritz did to the eggs." He grunted. Both would be presumptuous. Then, after a pause, "Sit down, Archie." That tone meant this wasn't a post-case chat. I sat. "Inspector Kramer telephoned at 8, Wolfe said. "Valmont is in custody. He has not confessed but has ceased denying. Mr. Bellini corroborated the financial transactions. Miss Renard confirmed her unintentional complicity. Mr. Duret, however, has withdrawn his statement." I blinked. "Withdrawn? You mean he's protecting Valmont now?" "Hardly. He claims," Wolfe said slowly, "that Valmont may not have been the true architect, that another hand guided him. He mentioned a letter. That got my attention." "What kind of letter?" "He refused to say, except that it arrived 2 days before the poisoning and concerned an arrangement between himself and an anonymous investor. He now asserts that this letter may have incited Valmont's actions." I frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Valmont had motive enough: control, revenge, ego. Why complicate it with mystery correspondence?" "Because," Wolfe said softly, "human greed prefers layers. It camouflages itself under reason. Duret's letter may have been bait." He closed the paper and leaned forward slightly, his version of urgency. "You will go to the restaurant. Retrieve that letter if it exists. If Duret refuses, remind him that I am not in the habit of rescuing fools twice." I went, though not without curiosity gnawing at the edges. Le Palais Vert was closed, its gleaming facade now guarded by a sign that said, "Closed for private event." Inside, the staff moved like ghosts. Duret was in his office, looking older, thinner, and twice as tired as yesterday. The man who'd once commanded a kitchen like an orchestra conductor now looked like someone who'd lost the score. "Mr. Duret," I said. "Wolfe sent me. He says you've been holding out." He gave a dry laugh. "You Americans, so direct." "Yes, there was a letter. It came the day before the critics' dinner. A courier delivered it, no name, no return address. It warned me that Valmont intended to betray me. It also suggested I secure insurance, a document proving his manipulation of funds. Did you?" "I tried," Duret said. "I searched the accounts, the supplier ledgers, but found nothing. Then the poisoning happened, and I assumed the letter was some malicious trick. Still have it." He nodded toward a drawer. I opened it and found a folded sheet of cream stationery, the kind favored by lawyers or people who liked pretending to be them. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and unsigned. Wolfe would have approved of the penmanship, even if he despised the purpose. "You ever recognize the writing?" I asked. Duret shook his head. "No, but the phrasing, it was too intimate, as if the writer knew my habits, my pride. Perhaps someone who worked with us once, or still does," I said. He didn't answer. I took the letter and promised to return it after Wolfe had a look. When I got back, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him, as though the hours had passed only for the rest of us. I handed him the letter. He unfolded it carefully, read it once, twice, then held it up to the light. His brows knitted. "Ah," he said finally, "ink residue, faint but telling. And the choice of paper, custom stock from Montclair and Sons, used primarily by legal offices and by Le Palais Vert's corporate accountant." "Which means?" That the letter originated not from a rival, Wolfe said, but from within their own administration. He set the paper down and tapped it once with his forefinger. Mr. Valmont was a tool, Mr. Dure a victim. The author of this letter engineered both outcomes. Someone who understood how to play men against each other while remaining unseen. Any names in mind? Wolfe didn't answer immediately. He reached for the phone again and dialed. "Fritz," he said, "inform Mr. Panzer that I require a background on Le Palais Vert's financial manager, Miss Elise Norton. She will have worked under Valmont's supervision. I suspect she will not enjoy scrutiny." I raised an eyebrow. "You think their accountant wrote that?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that Miss Norton's sense of opportunity exceeded her loyalty. It is not uncommon for those who manage numbers to imagine they manage men." "By evening," Saul had called back. Wolfe listened in silence, thanked him, and hung up. "As I expected," he said. "Miss Norton resigned this morning. No notice. Her bank account was emptied within the hour. Running, undoubtedly." I leaned back. "So the quiet one in the background pulls the strings." I have to hand it to her. She played them all perfectly. "Not perfectly," Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing. "She left traces. The letter, the timing of withdrawals, the courier who delivered the envelope. Saul will find her. But understand, Archie, this is not a pursuit for vengeance. It is about equilibrium. One cannot allow manipulation to masquerade as fate." There was something in his tone then, something colder than usual, almost personal. I wondered, not for the first time, how many times Wolfe had encountered minds like Norton's, calculating, patient, and cruel. By midnight, Saul reported again. Elise Norton had boarded a train to Boston, under an assumed name, carrying a single suitcase. Wolfe instructed him to let her go. "Let her go?" I said. "After all that?" "She will surface," he said simply. "Ambition always does. And when she does, she will require an accomplice, or a confessor. Either will suffice." The next morning, Kramer called to confirm Valmont's arraignment. The press had already turned the story into high cuisine, poisoned palates and betrayed partners. Dure's reputation was bruised but intact. Claire Renard had resigned quietly. Bellini's business was under review, and Wolfe's phone had not stopped ringing with would-be clients seeking salvation through logic. He turned them all away. By the third evening, the brownstone had returned to its steady rhythm. Fritz humming in the kitchen, the smell of thyme and butter in the air, and Wolfe back with his orchids, murmuring in Latin to something that at least didn't argue. As for me, I sat in the office writing this all down, thinking about Elise Norton on her train, about Valmont staring at the walls of a cell, and about Wolfe, whose only real expression of satisfaction had been a single line at dinner. "Archie," he'd said, pouring his beer, "gluttony takes many forms. Some devour food, some fortune, some men, but all in the end choke on themselves." That was Wolfe's way of closing the book. Mine was simpler. I just looked across the desk at him, thinking how even the cleverest criminals never quite understand the same thing I sometimes forget. You can't poison truth. It has too much flavor to die. 3 nights later, I was starting to think Wolfe's prophecy about Elise Norton surfacing again was just his way of easing himself back into boredom. The brownstone had resumed its routine. Orchids in the morning, clients politely refused in the afternoon, and Fritz's trout amandine making its entrance at 7 sharp. The truffle case had been tied up in a neat little bow, too neat for my liking. Wolfe's mind was like a fine net. It didn't like loose threads, and neither did I, but he'd gone silent, which meant the thread was still there, just invisible. That Friday evening, around 8, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the phone rang. Fritz answered, murmured a few polite words, and appeared in the office doorway looking uncharacteristically uneasy. "Mr. Wolfe, it is for you," he said. "A lady. She says her name is Elise Norton." Wolfe's eyes opened halfway, and for a second they brightened with that sharp gleam that only appeared when a case refused to stay dead. "Put her through." Her voice came over the line, cool and composed, but there was a quiver underneath, like fine glass under pressure. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm told you have a talent for discretion. I'm in a situation that requires strategic clarity." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Most people who call me are in one." "Where are you, Miss Norton?" "New Haven," she said. "At the Alden Hotel. I cannot stay long. There are people looking for me, people who believe I betrayed them." "Did you?" Wolfe asked. There was a pause. "I prefer to think of it as redistribution. But I didn't poison anyone. I merely exposed the arrogance that financed them." Wolfe grunted softly. "Miss Norton, your vocabulary is ambitious. Come to New York, tomorrow noon. Bring whatever remains of your conscience. I may yet preserve it." "I can't," she said quickly. "They're watching the trains. If I can reach you, I will." Then the line went dead. Wolfe stared at the receiver for a moment, set it down and muttered, "So, the spider grows restless." I said, "You think she's in danger?" "Miss Norton is dangerous," Wolfe said. "The distinction matters." He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. "Nevertheless, I expect her by tomorrow. Perhaps not alive, but certainly consequential." I didn't ask what that meant. When Wolfe began talking like a coroner with a thesaurus, it was best to let him finish the thought himself. But the next morning the doorbell interrupted breakfast. I went to the door expecting the milkman and found a courier in a grey uniform, holding a thin envelope addressed to Nero Wolfe, Esquire, no sender. The handwriting was the same neat, deliberate script as Duret's mysterious letter. Inside was a single line, typed, not written: "You were right about the poison, but wrong about the motive." Underneath, in smaller type, "Look to the critic." Wolfe read it twice. "Clever," he said finally. "She intends to bait me." "Maybe she's warning you," I said. "She's incapable of warning anyone. Every action of hers is a move in a ledger, calculated, transactional." He reached for his beer. "Nevertheless, she is correct. The critic's collapse was too convenient." "You think he was in on it?" "I think he was never meant to die," Wolfe said. "And I think Miss Norton knew precisely why." By noon I was on the subway to the Chronicle offices, where the critic, Elliot Graves, was convalescing behind his desk, pale but recovered. He received me with the kind of sniff reserved for uninvited guests and low-quality cigars. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "I suppose you've come to ask whether I enjoyed my near-death experience?" "Only professionally," I said. "We're reviewing ingredients," he smirked. "Ah, yes, you're Mr. Wolfe, brilliant fellow. I'd have enjoyed meeting him if I hadn't been busy losing consciousness. What is it you want?" "A name," I said. "Who told you to dine at Le Palais Vert that night?" Graves blinked. "No one told me." "I was invited. By whom?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Elise Norton. She sent a letter saying there was a special preview of a new truffle dish, something groundbreaking. She said Valmont had personally requested my presence. Did you ever meet her in person?" "Once, briefly. She delivered the invitation herself." "Efficient woman." "I took her for a publicity agent." "Did she seem nervous?" Graves shook his head. "No, amused, like she already knew what would happen. That was enough for me. I thanked him, left him to his ego, and caught a cab back to the brownstone. When I walked into the office, Wolfe was exactly where I'd left him. But the orchid room door was open, which meant he'd been thinking, never a good sign for anyone else involved. "She lured the critic," I said. "Personally," Wolfe nodded. "Then her intent was never murder. It was exposure. She orchestrated Valmont's fall, Duret's disgrace, and the critic's collapse to illuminate a single truth. Which is that corruption, like fungus, thrives in darkness." Wolfe's eyes opened fully now, sharp and bright. "But she miscalculated the reaction. The poison was too potent. She meant to cause alarm, not scandal. The critic's illness brought Kramer, and Kramer brought me. Now she runs because her experiment succeeded too well. So what now?" I asked. "We wait," he said. "Miss Norton will return. She cannot resist an audience capable of understanding her design. Vanity is the artist's narcotic, and Wolfe was right again. That night around 11 the bell rang. I opened the door to find Elise Norton standing there in a long grey coat, rain dripping from the hem. She looked calm, almost serene, the kind of calm that either comes from confession or exhaustion. "Mr. Goodwin," she said softly, "may I come in?" I led her to the office, where Wolfe had already prepared 2 chairs and a glass of sherry. He didn't rise but inclined his head. "Miss Norton." "You took your time." "I had to be sure I wasn't followed," she said. "Valmont's associates have longer memories than morals." "Sit," Wolfe said. "Explain." She did quietly, efficiently, like she was reading minutes from a meeting. She had discovered Valmont's embezzlement months earlier. Instead of exposing him outright, she devised what she called a moral correction, a demonstration of what greed could do when left unchecked. She'd arranged the critic's visit, the tainted purée, the letter to Duret, all to set the stage for Valmont's undoing. "It was never meant to kill," she said, "just to show him, to show them how fragile their power was." "And what did you intend to show yourself?" Wolfe asked. She hesitated. "That I could balance the scales." "For once." "You failed," Wolfe said flatly. "You substituted chaos for correction. A child's tantrum dressed in ethics." Her eyes flashed. "You don't understand. They destroyed people for profit, ruined suppliers, bribed critics." "Miss Norton," he said, voice cutting through her protest like a blade, "justice sought through deceit is merely another form of rot. You poisoned more than a puree. You poisoned your own cause." For a long time no one spoke. The rain drummed softly against the windows. Finally she said, "What will you do?" "Nothing," Wolfe said. "Kramer will have his villain in Valmont. You will vanish again. That will be sufficient punishment." She stared at him for a moment, then stood. "You think you're sparing me," she said quietly. "But you're wrong. You're sentencing me to live with what I did." Wolfe inclined his head. "Precisely." She left without another word. I closed the door behind her, and Wolfe let out a breath that might have been relief or regret. "Archie," he said finally, "Fritz will have supper ready." "And please, no truffles," I smiled faintly. "Noted. Though I doubt we'll see them in this kitchen again for a while." He leaned back, closing his eyes. An acceptable loss, and that was that. Another human labyrinth mapped and sealed. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the city clean, at least for a night. Inside, the brownstone settled into its quiet rhythm again. Order restored, appetite tempered, and the faint scent of sherry lingering like the echo of a confession that no one, least of all Wolfe, would ever forget. It rained the next morning, a slow, deliberate drizzle that muffled the city and gave the brownstone that peculiar hush it only wore after a storm, whether meteorological or moral. Fritz was polishing the silver. Wolfe, as usual, was communing with his orchids, and I was pretending to read the Chronicle, mostly to see whether Elliot Graves had learned anything from being the guest of honor at a poisoning. He hadn't. The headline was all self-pity and adjectives. By noon the air had cleared, and Wolfe emerged from the plant rooms like a bear returning from hibernation. He looked rested, but there was something in his eyes, an echo of thought not yet dismissed. When Wolfe let a case linger after it was solved, it meant that somewhere beneath all the neat logic, something still rankled. He lowered himself into the big chair with the gravity of a king resuming his throne. "Archie," he said, "has there been any news of Miss Norton?" "Nothing official. Kramer says she's vanished clean. No tickets, no trail, no complaints. Like she dissolved." "She has not," Wolfe said, pouring himself a beer. "People rarely dissolve. They ferment." "Comforting," I said. "So you're still chewing on her?" He made a sound halfway between a grunt and a sigh. "Miss Norton's confession was too measured. She volunteered guilt, yes, but only the portion she could afford to lose. She built her confession like a pâté, rich enough to satisfy but designed to conceal what lies underneath. You think she's hiding someone?" I think she's protecting something. He took a long drink. Her scheme required precision, timing, access, money. That suggests partnership. The question is whether her partner still lives in ignorance or betrayal. That got my pulse moving again. Wolfe didn't reopen files lightly. You want me to dig? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, Mr. Duret sent a crate of vintage Burgundy this morning as gratitude. Fritz will appreciate it. I, however, prefer clarity to wine. You will visit him, under pretense of thanks. Observe him. Observe him for what? He's already had his career gutted and stitched back together. Precisely, Wolfe said. Trauma breeds candor or foolishness. Either may serve us. By 4 I was at Le Palais Vert again. The place had reopened, thinner and quieter. Duret was in the dining room, arranging silverware himself, a task I doubted he'd done in decades. When he saw me, he smiled without warmth. Ah, Mr. Goodwin, you come to inspect the ruins? Just delivering gratitude from Mr. Wolfe, I said. And maybe a question or two. He's curious whether you've heard from Miss Norton. His face twitched. No, nor do I wish to. That woman nearly destroyed everything I built. Funny, I said. Wolfe thinks she wasn't working alone. Duret's hands froze over a napkin. He didn't answer right away. Alone or not, he said finally. Her motives were venom disguised as virtue. If she had a partner, he'll find she's better at betrayal than loyalty. Any names? None that I'd speak. His voice had gone soft, deliberate. Some debts are settled in silence, which was as close to an admission as I expected. Still, there was something about the way he said silence, like a man invoking a pact. When I got back, Wolfe listened, eyes shut, fingers steepled. He knows, he said when I finished, but he will not tell, which means the partner was someone he cannot afford to expose. You think she was protecting him? Perhaps. Or he her. He opened his eyes. They were co-conspirators in the same theater, chef and accountant bound by ambition. She staged the moral drama. He cooked the evidence. He let Valmont burn to save himself, and she took the blame to preserve her illusion of control. That's a pretty theory, I said. Are you planning to test it? I plan, Wolfe said slowly, to let it prove itself. 2 days later the proof came, wrapped in cheap stationery and addressed to Mr. Nero Wolfe. Inside was a brief note in Duret's elegant hand. I have decided to leave New York. You will find that Miss Norton's cause was not hers alone. I hope you will forgive my silence. It was not cowardice but mercy. It was signed simply, Lucien. That night Wolfe didn't speak through dinner. Fritz's coq au vin went cold, while Wolfe stared into his glass as though it contained the moral geometry of mankind. Finally he said, He has gone to her. Meaning they were never adversaries. They were accomplices in philosophy, if not in fact. He understood her vanity. She admired his precision. Together they sought to expose corruption, and when it collapsed, they mistook destruction for justice. Now in flight they imagine themselves redeemed. Sounds romantic, I said. It is idiotic, Wolfe replied. But idiocy, when dressed in conscience, often looks noble. We didn't hear from either of them again. Kramer closed the case. The Chronicle moved on to fresher scandals, and the city's appetite forgot the taste of truffles for a while. Wolfe returned to his orchids, Fritz to his sauces, and I to the steady rhythm of paperwork and sarcasm. But some nights when the house was too quiet, I'd think about Duret and Norton, the chef and the accountant, running somewhere in the grey margins of Europe, convinced they'd outwitted the world. I knew better, because what Wolfe had said once stayed with me. You cannot poison truth. He was right. It doesn't die. It just waits. And somewhere in a small cafe or an empty train car, I like to think they realize that too. That all their cleverness, their schemes and speeches and moral balancing acts, were nothing against the simple inevitability Wolfe embodied from his chair. That knowledge, once uncovered, never goes back to sleep. So when Wolfe finally closed the file on the chef's Last Supper, I didn't ask him if he thought they'd ever return. I already knew the answer. He looked up from his beer, eyes calm, voice steady. "They are not the first," he said, "to mistake righteousness for reason. Nor will they be the last." He took another sip, leaned back, and added softly, "Still, it is a pity. They understood flavor but not consequence. That was Wolfe's version of an epitaph. Mine was simpler." I just looked at him, nodded once, and said, "At least this time nobody choked." He grunted, and Fritz appeared with dessert. The storm had passed. The brownstone breathed again. Outside, the city hummed, restless and hungry. Inside, Wolfe lifted his fork, serene as ever, and the world for the moment was back in order. 2 quiet weeks passed. The brownstone resumed its sacred rhythm, that slow, deliberate cadence Wolfe lived by. Orchids from 9 to 11, beer at 11 sharp, lunch at 1, and the rest of the day given to reading, digestion, and indifference to the world. He had retreated into his usual shell, not speaking of Duret or Elise Norton again, and I took that as a sign that for him the matter was closed. For me it wasn't. Cases don't die just because the clock says they should. Sometimes they just go underground like roots waiting for rain. I tried to let it go, I really did. But there was something about that letter Duret sent before vanishing that didn't sit right. Wolfe had read it once, folded it, and tucked it into a drawer like he was putting away a memory. He never mentioned it again. That alone was suspicious. Wolfe never forgets a puzzle, only stores it for future consumption. Then one evening the rain came back, a low, heavy drizzle that wrapped Manhattan in fog and melancholy. I was in the office, sorting the week's bills, when the phone rang. It was a long-distance operator. "Collect call for Mr. Nero Wolfe from Paris," she said. I glanced at Wolfe, who was sunk deep in his chair, reading Montaigne as though the world outside didn't exist. "Put it through," I said. The voice that came on was faint but unmistakably foreign, French, clipped, breathless. "Mr. Wolfe, this is Inspector Gérard Duval of the Sûreté Nationale. I apologize for the intrusion, but I believe we share a case." Wolfe didn't move. "Explain," he said. "There was an incident at a small hotel near Lyon," Duval said. 2 Americans registered under false names, a man and a woman. They were found dead this morning. The cause appears to be poison. Among their belongings was a card with your name and address." For a moment, the air in the room went still. I heard the ticking of the clock, the soft sigh of the rain, and the faint metallic click of Wolfe setting down his book. "Describe them," he said quietly. The man, perhaps in his 40s, dark hair, scar on his left wrist. The woman, blonde, well-dressed, intelligent eyes. She had a letter in her handbag, signed by one Archie Goodwin. I looked up sharply. "That's impossible." Wolfe ignored me. "Inspector, how soon can you send me photographs and a transcript of that letter?" "Immediately," Duval said. "But I warn you, monsieur, this looks like suicide." When the line went dead, Wolfe sat motionless for a full minute, his fingers pressed together beneath his chin. Finally, he said, "Archie, bring me the letter Duret sent before he left." I opened the drawer, retrieved it, and handed it over. He read it again, slowly this time, tracing each word like he was tasting it for the first time. "Mercy," he murmured. He said it was mercy. He looked up. "Archie, prepare yourself. You will go to France." I stared at him. "You're sending me across the Atlantic for a couple of corpses." "They are not corpses," he said. "They are consequences, and consequences, Mr. Goodwin, are my least favorite form of indigestion." By the next evening I was on a plane. The Sûreté met me at Charles de Gaulle. Inspector Duval himself, a trim man with sharp eyes and the faint air of someone who'd read too much Simenon for his own good. He drove me south to Lyon, explaining as we went. "They took a room under the names Mr. and Mrs. Laurent," he said. "Quiet couple, paid in cash. No arguments, no visitors. They dined together last night, shared a bottle of wine, and this morning, both dead. The maid found them. The wine contained digitalis. I didn't say anything for a while. "You're sure it's them?" He handed me 2 photographs, Duret thinner but still recognizable. Elise, her expression oddly peaceful. I stared at them until the car hit a bump and jolted me back into myself. At the hotel, the scene was still cordoned off. The room was small, modest, and heartbreakingly ordinary. 2 suitcases, 2 glasses on the table, a single half-eaten loaf of bread. Beside the bed, a folded sheet of paper lay on the nightstand. Duval handed it to me carefully, as though it might shatter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Elise Norton's, neat and deliberate to the end. To those who seek reason in our ruin, we wanted to cleanse what could not be cleaned. We failed. We could not live with failure. Forgive us our final vanity. Below it, Duret's signature joined hers like a seal. I felt something twist in my chest. Not pity, exactly, but that hollow recognition Wolfe always called the echo of futility. Duval watched me. "You knew them well?" "Well enough to wish I hadn't," I said. When I got back to New York, Wolfe was waiting. He didn't ask questions. He already knew the answers. I handed him the letter and the photographs. He studied them briefly, then placed them on the desk and leaned back. "So," he said, "they completed the circle." "Looks that way," I said. "A chef and an accountant. Poison as punctuation." Wolfe nodded once. An ending suited to their temperament. They believed themselves authors of justice. Instead, they became its instruments. Duval called it mercy, I said. "Perhaps it was," Wolfe replied. "But mercy, like poison, is a matter of dose. Too little, it means nothing. Too much, it kills." He poured himself a beer, lifted it, and studied the golden foam as if searching for an epilogue. "I do not grieve them, Archie," he said finally, "but I regret them. There was intellect in both, misdirected but genuine. To waste such capacity on self-destruction is the truest obscenity." "Maybe they didn't see it as waste," I said quietly. "Maybe they thought it was balance." He looked at me then sharply, and something almost like weariness crossed his face. "Balance," he said. "A delusion men invoke when they lack the courage to endure imbalance." I didn't argue. Outside, the rain was tapering off again, leaving streaks of silver across the windows. The city hummed beyond the glass, restless, indifferent, alive. Wolfe took a long sip of his beer and set it down carefully. "Archie," he said, "remind Fritz that tomorrow's menu will include something restorative. A consommé, perhaps, and tell him to use the white truffle oil." I blinked. "Truffles, after all this?" He closed his eyes. "Life, Mr. Goodwin, must be lived despite its ironies." And that was all. The case, if you could still call it that, was finished. The file labeled "The Chef's Last Supper" went into Wolfe's cabinet, 3rd drawer from the bottom, where he keeps the unsatisfactory ones, the ones that don't end cleanly. Later that night, as I sat in the office alone, I could still hear the faint echo of Elise's words. "Forgive us our final vanity." Maybe Wolfe was right. Maybe it wasn't mercy at all. But as the city sighed outside, I couldn't help thinking that somewhere in that grey middle between justice and guilt, between intellect and ruin, there was a kind of fragile peace neither of them had found in life. When I turned off the lamp and headed upstairs, Wolfe's voice floated softly from the darkness. "Archie, tomorrow remind me to order a new supply of truffles. We must not let the innocent suffer for the sins of the guilty." I smiled into the dark. "Noted, boss," I said. "Case closed." I hadn't expected the brownstone to feel that quiet again so soon. After Duret and Elise Norton's final act, the silence that settled into Wolfe's house had weight to it, like the last echo in a cathedral. Fritz moved quietly, the phone stayed mercifully still, and even the orchids seemed to droop in shared fatigue. Some cases ended with noise, some with headlines. This one ended like a door softly closing. A week later, Inspector Kramer stopped by. You could tell he didn't like it. His expression was that of a man forced to eat crow and finding it overcooked. He stood just inside the door, hat in hand, chewing on his cigar as if hoping to strangle it. "So, Wolfe," he said finally, "Paris sends their regards. Says you were right about those two, poison. Double dose, no foul play, just their own doing, damn waste." "Life often is," Wolfe said evenly. "Sit, Inspector." Kramer didn't. He just looked at the orchids, at Wolfe, then at me, as if trying to decide which one of us to blame. "You ever think you go too far with this stuff?" "Frequently," Wolfe said. "And every time I am reminded that truth is not a matter of moderation." Kramer snorted. "Yeah, well, if you ask me, they were both nuts. Too smart for their own good. People who think too much usually end up poisoning somebody, even if it's just themselves." He left on that note, and for once, Wolfe didn't argue. When the door closed, Wolfe reached for his beer. "Kramer, for all his bluster," he said, "occasionally grazes wisdom." I grinned. "You mean by accident?" "Precisely," he said. For the next few days, Wolfe said little. He read more than usual, dictating occasional notes on moral philosophy and appetite, two subjects he considered inseparable. He never mentioned Duret or Elise by name again, but sometimes when Fritz brought out the truffle dish he'd once banned, Wolfe would pause before tasting, just for a heartbeat, as if considering whether flavor could ever really be innocent. It was on one of those afternoons, when the rain had lifted and sunlight cut through the blinds in sharp, clean stripes, that he finally spoke again about it. "Archie," he said, "you have often accused me of lacking sentiment." "Not accused," I said. "Observed." He ignored that. "Yet sentiment, when properly disciplined, is merely recognition of consequence. I am not unmoved by Duret and Miss Norton's folly. It was an attempt, misguided though it was, to assert moral order in a disordered world. The tragedy was not in their intent, but in their execution. Poison's a lousy delivery system for justice," I said. He smiled faintly. "Justice, Mr. Goodwin, is merely the palate's illusion of balance. The wise man seeks not justice, but comprehension." "That's easy for a man who never leaves his chair." Wolfe's eyes half closed. "And yet comprehension often arrives only to those who sit still long enough to recognize it." That was my cue to let him have the last word. "I've learned that arguing philosophy with Wolfe is like shadowboxing with a wall. The wall always wins." That night after dinner I went upstairs early but couldn't sleep. The case, for all its neatness, had left a residue, something about the way Elise's letter had been worded. That phrase, "forgive us our final vanity." Wolfe had called it vanity. Kramer had called it madness. But to me it looked more like surrender. They'd both been trying to fix a world that didn't want fixing. Wolfe, in his way, did the same thing. But he did it from his chair, with words instead of poison. Maybe that was the only real difference. I must have dozed off at my desk, because when I woke the house was dark except for the faint glow from Wolfe's office. I went down, half expecting to find him asleep. Instead, he was sitting there, wide awake, staring at the truffle jar, the same one from the start of it all, now empty, scrubbed clean and resting like an artifact from a bygone war. He looked up as I came in. "Archie," he said quietly, "do you know why I kept this? Because you never throw anything away that reminds you you're smarter than everyone else?" He smiled, barely. A tempting hypothesis. But no. I keep it because it represents the peril of curiosity unrestrained. A thing meant for pleasure became an instrument of despair. It is, therefore, a reminder that intellect, divorced from discipline, is merely appetite by another name. "Maybe," I said, "but it's still just a jar." "Yes," he said, "and so is man." That stopped me. I didn't answer. There are times when Wolfe's words stop being clever and start being true, and you can't joke your way past them. He leaned back then, the weight of thought easing off him like a tide receding. "Enough," he said. "You will file the case. Title it, 'The Chef's Last Supper.' It will not be opened again." I nodded, and he closed his eyes. I could almost hear the shutters of his mind locking one by one, sealing away the ghosts that came with reason. The next morning life returned to normal, or as normal as it ever got under that roof. Breakfast at 9, orchids at 11, and a brief argument at noon about the relative merits of Armagnac versus cognac in dessert sauces. Fritz and I were both grateful for the noise. But later, as I walked past the office, I saw the jar still sitting on the desk catching the afternoon light. Wolfe had said the case was closed, but he hadn't moved it to storage. He kept it there, a small, gleaming reminder of how thin the line is between intellect and indulgence, between justice and its imitation. I stood there a moment, then shut the door quietly. Sometimes in this line of work you don't get happy endings. You just get endings. Tidy, logical, and lonely. But as I heard Wolfe's voice from the kitchen asking Fritz about lunch, I figured maybe that was enough. Wolfe had his orchids, I had my sanity, and New York had one less poisoner, and for the moment that would do.